Back in 2013, I read a brief article on the web about a group of women called the Harvey Girls that I'd never heard of before. I learned that starting back in the late 1800s, they were employed by a chain of restaurants called Harvey Houses scattered throughout the Southwest along the routes of a major railroad line from Kansas through Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. You might say Harvey Houses were the forerunner of the Howard Johnson's restaurants that later lined the highways in the eastern U.S. Howard Deering Johnson had opened his first drugstore with a soda fountain that sold ice cream in Massachusetts in 1929. He introduced a special new kind of ice cream with double the butter fat of most ice cream at the time, which gave it a richer flavor than other brands. And he offered it in an amazing choice of 28 different flavors. The ice cream became so popular he was able to begin authorizing others to sell it in franchise shops. Eventually, the ice cream business was revised and expanded into a chain of sit-down restaurants that spread along the East Coast. When the famous Pennsylvania Turnpike was built in 1940, Johnson bid for and won the exclusive rights to create restaurants connected to the service station turnoffs along that toll road. The narrative on the back of this postcard from 1952, published by the Howard Johnson's Company and distributed at their restaurants, describes that partnership. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, the greatest of all man-made wonders over whose smooth surface millions have traveled since its opening. For 260 miles, not a stop sign, traffic light, crossroad or street, no grade over 3%, which, instead of climbing over the peaks of the Alleghenies, dives through them in 7 well-ventilated, well-illuminated tunnels. Throughout the entire length of the turnpike, gasoline service stations and restaurants are located on both sides of the roadway at staggered points. The restaurants are most attractive and are operated by the famous Howard Johnson, where good food can be obtained at reasonable prices. I can still remember stopping for the first time to eat at a Howard Johnson's on the Pennsylvania Turnpike when I was 7 years old in the early 1950s. I was traveling with my parents from Ohio to visit family on the East Coast. It looked exactly like this one. Before long, these restaurants with the orange roofs, quaint colonial-style architecture, and Simple Simon and the Pieman iconic neon sign were also lining almost every highway across the country that we traveled on for family vacations over the years. From the very beginning, I was particularly enamored of their amazingly tasty grilled hot dogs, served on a rectangular bun that was buttered and grilled like a grilled cheese sandwich. And for breakfast, I loved their corn toasties, a sweet cornbread treat that came in thin little square, flat, toasted cakes. Those were so wildly popular with Hojo guests across the country that they eventually sold them pre-packaged in the frozen food section of your local grocery. You could pop them in a toaster, just like a Pop-Tart. The first Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge debuted in 1954 in Savannah, Georgia. The chain reached its peak in 1975 when there were more than 1,000 restaurants and more than 500 motor lodges in 42 states and Canada. The Howard Johnson chain went out of business years ago, with many of its old buildings sold off to other motel chains and refurbished for their own use. You can still see that very first Howard Johnson Motor Lodge in Savannah today, but don't go looking for the Howard Johnson logo sign anywhere on the property. Years ago, the building was purchased by the Savannah College of Art and Design and was refurbished to serve as one of the college's dormitories. Yes, in its heyday, the Howard Johnson Company was the biggest thing going in the hospitality field. During all those heyday years, all those Howard Johnson's restaurants featured waitresses rather than male waiters. As you can see from this guidebook for their wait staff, they referred to their waitresses as Johnson girls. In fact, most family restaurants during the heyday of Howard Johnson's from the 1930s through the 1970s almost always had a totally female wait staff. But back in the era when the Harvey girls were first introduced as waitresses, in the early 1880s, it was almost unheard of for respectable women to work in any capacity in public eating places, such as saloons, in the Old West. Those who did were assumed to have the loose moral character of dance hall girls at best or prostitutes at worst. Even Miss Kitty, shown here as played by actress Amanda Blake from the 1950s Gunsmoke TV show that was set in the same era, just barely got away with any respectability. In fact, on the original radio version of the show, which began in 1952, it was hinted broadly and later admitted by the scriptwriter that she was intended indeed to be a prostitute, or perhaps even a madam of a brothel. That was too racy for the 1950s TV, of course, so her role was promptly clarified on the TV show when it began in 1955 as being just part owner of the Long Branch Saloon. The owner of the very respectable Harvey House restaurants had started out hiring the standard male waiters for his new chain of restaurants. But in the area where the restaurants were being built, part of the proverbial Wild West, it turned out that some male waiters tended to be too rowdy and undependable for a respectable eating establishment. Sometimes they even got into drunken brawls among themselves. In 1883, a manager at one of the restaurants made the startling proposal that they should try hiring young women instead, and the chain owner agreed. But the owner had a plan to get past the prejudices against female employees in restaurants. That plan included what you see here, a uniform that eliminated any hint of female promiscuity. A shapeless pitch black dress with long sleeves, a high collar, a hem to the floor, and a starched white apron. It gave the distinct feel of a secular version of a nun's garb from that period, like this group of nuns. All that was missing was a headpiece. In addition, just like nuns, a Harvey girl was never to wear makeup or decorative jewelry. Surprisingly, though, the young women were not expected to be totally quiet and subservient, and with bland personalities to match their uniform. as they went about serving customers, most of whom were males. On the contrary, the company only hired young women who were educated, poised, outgoing, pleasant-looking, good conversationalists, and good at putting others at ease. Strangely enough, they weren't usually hired from the towns and cities where the restaurants were being built. Ads in women's magazines and newspapers around the chain's headquarters in Kansas and farther east recruited young unmarried women ages 18 to 30 to come to the chain's offices in Kansas City or Chicago, where they were interviewed and offered a job if they met the requirements. If accepted, they found themselves on a train in a few short days, headed out west to a new life. At their destination, they were provided free room and board and required to stay in dormitories altogether, with a strict older woman as sort of a headmistress, like in a girls' school, who made sure all the young women maintained the highest behavioral standards at all times. In exchange, the young women received decent wages and job security. And because the Harvey House restaurants developed a national reputation for exceptionally good food and service, the Harvey girls could count on good tips to supplement their income. Although most Americans in the 21st century have never even heard of the Harvey girls, this was not so 75 years ago. Their story was so familiar to many in the general public that a novel with a plot set in the 1890s was published in 1942, loosely based on the Harvey girls' history. And the novel was popular enough that it was chosen as the basis of a 1946 movie musical starring Judy Garland, which did well at the box office and earned an Oscar for the Best Song of the Year. Perhaps you've heard it on a radio station that plays oldies. The title was On the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. I found the idea of this story about the Harvey girls fascinating and decided to write up a short article about it for one of my blogs. The main point of what I'd read about the Harvey girls at that time was that they were instrumental in taming the Wild West, so that's what I titled my article. As waitresses, their mere presence encouraged much better behavior in men, including rough and rowdy cowboys, inside the eating establishments. With so few single women in many areas of the frontier other than prostitutes, even most of those rowdier cowboys were cowed into minding their manners in the presence of a dignified, well-spoken young woman. And many of these young women who accepted the offer of a frontier adventure as a Harvey girl did so in part because it was common knowledge that the clientele of the Harvey houses, from traveling businessmen to train employees to cattlemen, were a good source of potential husbands. Their expectations in this were not disappointed. Tens of thousands of Harvey girls over the decades got married to men they served meals to in Harvey House restaurants. And most of those settled down in surrounding areas, raising families, and often becoming direct participants in creating new, family-friendly communities. Another way they helped tame that Wild West. Recently, I looked back at that old article I had written a decade ago and thought it might be fun to turn the material into a short documentary video. I even started working on that short video, thinking I would mostly just use the text of the article for the narration while showing on screen the photos I'd used to illustrate it. But I made the mistake of thinking it might be useful to look up a little more information about the Harvey girls just to round out the article a bit. As I began Googling the topic, I quickly realized that a decade later there was a whole lot more information on the web about the Harvey girls. And as I dipped into some of it, I discovered that the story of the Harvey girls was just the tip of an iceberg. They were only one facet of an amazing, sprawling, much bigger story that spanned over 100 years. It was a story that wove the fascinating history of the extended family of one amazing Victorian-era man and the family business he started into over a century of the fabric of the history of America as a nation. Like the name of an old radio soap opera that ran from the 1930s through the 1950s, you might say it is the story of one man's family. That one Victorian-era man's name was Fred Harvey. And that story includes cameo appearances of many well-known names and faces from the past who interact in situations that involve Fred and his business and members of his family. Names from Billy the Kid to Will Rogers, from Bat Masterson to Albert Einstein. And that story involves many iconic events, circumstances, and activities you likely remember from your history classes, from the Civil War to World War II, from the Dust Bowl to the atomic bomb, and many influential events, circumstances, and activities you may never have heard of before, but that had significant repercussions that echoed over the decades right down to today. That is the much bigger story that we will explore in this series, On the Track of a Bigger Story.